The man who caused God to bleed was the only one in the church who didn't believe in him. A blasphemy, if I had not seen it with my own eyes. An impossible truth that ripped through the very fabric of my understanding, of my faith, of reality itself. My hands, calloused from years of holding the sacred, trembled not with reverence, but with a terror so profound it threatened to shatter every bone. I remember the moment with a clarity that sears the soul. An image burned into my retina, the collective gasp of 500 people, a singular guttural exhalation of shock that sucked all the air from the nave. Then, the sudden, sacred silence that followed, a stillness so deep you could hear the frantic beat of your own heart. And in that awful, holy hush, the sight of Arthur Crane, a man of cold steel and colder currency, a titan of industry who scoffed at anything that couldn't be measured, bought, or built, on his knees, his face a mask of utter soul-shattering terror. He had come to our final Mass at St. Jude's to gloat, to witness the final breath of a faith he despised, a faith he had systematically tried to dismantle with his legal challenges and his relentless offers for our sacred land. His presence in the front pew, usually reserved for the most devoted, was a calculated insult, a victory lap before he signed the papers that would condemn our church. I had felt his cynical gaze on me throughout the liturgy, a weight that pressed down even heavier than the despair I carried for my dwindling flock. My own voice had cracked as I spoke the words of consecration, my hope a thin, frayed thread against the crushing certainty of our defeat. I elevated the host, a pure white disk of unleavened bread, the physical manifestation of Christ's presence that I had held countless times, my fingers numb, my heart heavy. Then it happened, not a flicker, not a trick of the light. A single, perfect drop of crimson appeared at the very center of the host, as if from a pinprick, blossoming outwards with an agonizing slowness. Then another, and another, a dark, vibrant, shockingly wet red. It wasn't ink, it wasn't wine. It pulsed, alive as it began to trickle, a thin, glistening river running down the pristine white, adhering to the fragile surface, clinging to my thumb with an undeniable viscosity. It smelled faintly of iron, of life, of something profoundly, impossibly real. This was living blood. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, ragged gasp that never found release. My mind screamed. Every theological lesson, every rational explanation, every scientific principle shattered into dust. This was not symbolic. This was real. My own hands, holding the very body of Christ, now visibly bleeding. A sacrilege, a miracle, both. I too was a witness, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. The silence in the church was not empty, but filled with the sound of souls breaking and reforming. Whispers began, not of panic, but of profound, bewildered awe. A woman near the front, Mrs. Rodriguez, started to weep, a soft, choked sound that echoed in the stillness. But my gaze was locked on Arthur Crane. His face, usually a canvas of smug amusement or cold indifference, had gone ashen, almost transparent. The blood drained from it, leaving him cadaverous. His eyes, fixed on the bleeding wafer in my trembling hands, were wide, animalistic, reflecting a terror I had never seen in a human soul. This was not fear of God, not yet. This was fear of the impossible, the undeniable breach in his carefully constructed, godless universe. The man who built his empire on disproving the divine was watching his own foundations crumble, brick by agonizing brick. He had come to see the end of our faith. Instead, he saw its violent, undeniable reassertion. He came to gloat, and instead, he crumpled. He, Arthur Crane, the man of cold steel, was struck down, brought to his knees by the visible, agonizing proof of the God he mocked, a God who bled in plain sight. In that moment, the war for our parish, the battle for its very bricks and mortar, was suddenly, utterly irrelevant. A far greater war had just begun, not for a building, but for the soul of a man, for the soul of Arthur Crane, for every soul in that church, for the soul of the modern world itself. You will never believe it. No one would, not truly, until they saw it. I barely do, even now, with the memory scorched into my very being. But it happened, and the world was never the same. The memory of that moment, the bleeding host, Arthur Crane on his knees, it still burns, a holy brand upon my soul. But to truly understand the sheer earth-shattering impossibility of what transpired, To grasp the depth of God's mercy and the audaciousness of his intervention, you must first understand the landscape upon which that miracle was etched. You must know the weariness, the quiet despair, the slow, agonizing retreat of hope that preceded it. For before the miracle, there was the struggle. And for a shepherd of souls, that struggle was a daily, soul-testing crucible. My name is Father Michael, and for 32 years, St. Jude's was more than just a church. It was the very pulse of my life, the sacred ground where I had walked with my flock through countless seasons of joy and sorrow. It was a beautiful old church, built in the robust, unyielding style of the early 20th century, a testament to the fervent faith of immigrant generations who had poured their meager earnings and boundless hope into its very foundations. Its facade, once proud and gleaming, now bore the marks of time and neglect. Crumbling gargoyles gazing down with worn, stony eyes, patches of peeling paint on the great oak doors, and a bell tower that leaned ever so slightly, a silent, weary sentinel against the relentless march of modernity. Inside, the air still held the faint, sweet scent of old incense, mingled with dust and the memories of 1,000 prayers. Sunlight, when it managed to pierce through the grime of the stained glass windows, painted faded frescoes of saints and angels in muted golds and blues. The high-arched ceilings, once vibrant with celestial scenes, now showed spiderwebs like forgotten lacework. And in places, the plaster had begun to crack, snaking delicate, unsettling lines across the divine images. Each hairline fracture felt like a bruise upon my own spirit, a physical manifestation of the spiritual wounds my parish was enduring. We were a small, proud community, nestled in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying. Where once there were bustling, working-class families, now sleek, glass-fronted condominiums rose, casting long, cold shadows over our venerable stone structure. The corner bakery, the family-run grocery store, the shoemaker, they had all given way to artisanal coffee shops and minimalist galleries. Our beautiful old church, with its cracking plaster and fading frescoes, was deemed an eyesore by the city's new elite, an antiquated relic taking up valuable real estate. I'd overhear remarks, whispered perhaps, but loud enough for a priest with an attuned ear. Such a waste of space, or it really brings down the property values. Our finances, always modest, were now in shambles. The collection plates, once overflowing with the generosity of large families, now saw a few folded bills and a scattering of coins. Attendance was dwindling, a quiet erosion of faith mirrored in the church's physical decay. The children of our most faithful parishioners, drawn away by the bright lights and promises of the secular world, had stopped coming. The elderly, our most steadfast anchor, were passing on, leaving behind empty pews that echoed with unspoken absence. It was a slow, agonizing bleed, not unlike the one that would later stain the host. But this one was silent, insidious, a gradual draining of life from the very heart of St. Jude's. The heart of our problem, the relentless pressure squeezing the life out of us, had a name: Arthur Crane. He was a ruthless developer, a man whose empire was built not on bricks and mortar alone, but on ambition and a cold, calculating disregard for anything that couldn't be quantified on a ledger sheet. To him, our sacred ground was not a house of God, a sanctuary of souls, but merely a prime location for luxury condominiums. He saw our history, our faith, our very identity, as obstacles to be overcome, mere inconveniences on his path to greater wealth and power. I remember meeting him for the first time, a crisp autumn morning when he strode into my office, unannounced, his presence like a sudden chill in the warmth of my small book-lined sanctuary. He was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes a piercing blue that held no hint of softness. He didn't offer a handshake, merely laid a glossy brochure on my desk, showcasing sleek, towering glass structures. "Father Michael," he began, his voice smooth, devoid of inflection. "I'm Arthur Crane. I'm here to discuss the future of this property." He spoke of progress, of urban renewal, of maximizing potential. He spoke of the archaic structures that hampered a city's growth, and his gaze, though never directly dismissive, lingered on the crucifix above my desk with an almost clinical curiosity, as if analyzing an inefficient design. He was a man who believed only in what he could build and what he could buy. God, faith, community, tradition, these were intangible concepts, utterly irrelevant in his world of blueprints and balance sheets. He was determined to buy our history, to pave over our faith with concrete and glass, to erase St. Jude's from the map as if it had never existed. My attempts to explain the spiritual significance of St.
Jude's, the generations of baptisms and marriages, the solace found in its quiet corners, the very sanctity of consecrated ground, met with a polite but firm blankness. He listened, nodded, then countered with property values, zoning regulations, and the undeniable financial strain on the diocese. "Father," he'd once said, leaning forward, his voice a low, persuasive rumble, "I respect tradition in its place, but frankly, this church is hemorrhaging money. It's a liability, not an asset."
And God, if he exists, surely understands economics. The last part was delivered with a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, a dismissive flick of the wrist at the notion of divine intervention in the affairs of man. His pressure was relentless. It wasn't just formal offers to the diocese. It was a constant, insidious campaign. He bought up properties around the church, then complained about our dilapidated state to city council. He funded studies that highlighted the blight our church represented in an otherwise thriving neighborhood. He was a master manipulator, subtly turning public opinion against us, making us feel like an impediment to progress, an anachronism. I saw the toll it took on my flock. The quiet pride of our parishioners began to curdle into a simmering resentment, then, more tragically, into doubt. They saw their beloved church, their spiritual home, under siege, and the promises of faith seemed to offer little defense against the cold, hard reality of Arthur Crane's bulldozers. Father, Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman whose family had worshipped at St. Jude's for 4 generations, confided one Sunday after Mass, her voice barely a whisper, "Is God truly with us, or have we been forgotten?" Her eyes, usually so vibrant with unwavering faith, were clouded with a fear I recognized all too well, the fear of abandonment. My days became a blur of pastoral duties interspersed with increasingly desperate meetings with diocesan officials, who, while sympathetic, were also bound by worldly concerns. We couldn't afford the repairs, the insurance, the basic upkeep. The writing, it seemed, was on the wall. My heart ached. How could I, a humble priest, fight against such a formidable force, a man who scoffed at the very notion of spiritual power? I offered counsel. I offered comfort. I poured out prayers like water, but I felt a growing sense of helplessness. I was a shepherd watching his flock being scattered, not by a physical wolf, but by a tide of cynicism and materialism I could not fight with worldly means. I walked the aisles of St. Jude's late at night, the silence amplifying the creaks of the old building, the rustle of unseen things. I'd trace the worn grooves in the pews where generations had knelt. I'd run my hand over the cool marble of the altar, a place where heaven touched earth, and I would pray. Not for money, not for victory over Arthur Crane, but for strength, for guidance, for a sign, any sign, that God had not abandoned us, that he had not forgotten this weary shepherd and his dwindling, beleaguered flock. The world outside, the world of Arthur Crane, seemed to be winning, and in the quiet desperation of those nights, I wondered, truly wondered, if our faith, too, was slowly, irrevocably dying. The need for something extraordinary, something undeniably divine, festered within me, a silent, burning plea. The rustle of unseen things in the old church at night often felt like the whispers of forgotten prayers, or perhaps the sighs of a building itself, weary unto death. The air, even indoors, carried the crisp, biting chill of late autumn, seeping through ancient mortar and under vast arched windows that shimmered faintly with the reflected city lights. Each creak of the floorboards under my solitary footsteps, each groan of timber and stone settling deeper into its foundation, echoed the growing weariness in my own soul, a heavy counterpoint to the quiet desperation that had taken root within me. I remember tracing the worn grooves in the smooth, dark wood of the pews, deep indentations made by generations of kneeling knees, a silent testament to enduring faith, to untold confessions and whispered hopes. Yet now, the vast, echoing spaces felt emptier than ever, the stories of those who once filled them unfinished, fading like old frescoes into obscurity. I would run my hand over the cool, familiar marble of the altar, its surface smooth beneath my fingertips, a sacred place where heaven had touched earth countless times, where the miracle of Christ's presence had been invoked day after day. In those solitary pre-dawn hours, kneeling amidst the shadows that danced with the flickering sanctuary lamp, I poured out my heart, not for victory, not for wealth, nor for the mere preservation of the building, but for a sign, a flicker of divine light in the encroaching gloom, a whisper of guidance for a shepherd who felt utterly lost, watching his dwindling, beleaguered flock. The world outside, the world of Arthur Crane and his cold, calculating materialism, seemed to be winning. And in the quiet desperation of those nights, as the chill seeped into my bones, I wondered if our faith, too, was slowly, irrevocably dying. The need for something extraordinary, something undeniably divine, festered within me, a silent, burning plea, growing more urgent with each passing day. My deepest concern, however, wasn't for the building, beautiful and historic though it was, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows that told sacred stories in hues of ruby and sapphire. No, the ache in my heart was far more profound. It was for the spiritual health of my flock, for the precious souls entrusted to my care. I saw, with a clarity that stung, the insidious toll that Arthur Crane's relentless pressure, his dismissive rhetoric, and indeed, the very spirit of the age he embodied, an age that championed material gain above all else, was taking. It wasn't just about the financial strain that weighed on families, nor solely about the imminent threat of displacement from our spiritual home. It was a deeper, more corrosive erosion of hope itself. Faith, which should be a sturdy oak, rooted deep in the soil of tradition and unwavering trust, was being tested by the relentless, biting winds of cynicism and doubt, bending precariously under the onslaught, threatening to snap altogether. I saw it in the hesitant, almost apologetic smiles offered after Mass, in the downcast eyes that avoided mine when I offered a word of encouragement, in the slumped shoulders that spoke volumes more than any spoken lament. I heard it in the quiet conversations after services, hushed worries about rising bills and uncertain futures that always, inevitably, circled back to the agonizing question of God's presence, or perceived absence, in their suffering. Our once vibrant community, a beacon of light and fellowship in this often darkening world, was visibly dimming, and the sacred flame, the light of belief in many hearts, was flickering, threatening to be extinguished by the prevailing winds of secularism and despair. I felt each tremor of their doubt resonate within my own being, a shepherd whose greatest fear was to see his sheep lost in the gathering twilight. Among those who bore the weight of this struggle most visibly was Elena Diaz. Elena was, and remains, a true pillar of St. Jude's, a woman whose spirit seemed forged in the fires of unwavering devotion. Her hands, gnarled and calloused from decades of honest, back-breaking work, scrubbing floors, tending gardens, raising a family, were never idle. Whether arranging flowers for the altar, volunteering at the food bank, or most often, clenching her worn rosary beads, each one a whisper of hope against despair. Her hair, once the lustrous black of a raven's wing, was now beautifully threaded with streaks of silver, catching the light like gossamer, and her face, though lined, was etched with the profound, eloquent story of a life lived with both immense joy and profound sorrow. Every morning, without fail, before the city truly awoke, I would see her, a lone silhouette kneeling in the hushed pre-dawn light that filtered through the nave's high windows, painting the dust motes in streaks of pale gold and gray, her head bowed in supplication, her lips moving in silent prayer, a quiet murmur that seemed to fill the vast emptiness of the church with its sincerity. Her faith was not a fragile thing, easily broken. It was the kind that had withstood countless personal storms, rooted deep in the fertile soil of tradition and unwavering trust, a testament to generations of devotion. To see even Eleanor's radiant spirit shadowed by doubt, to see her stalwart faith begin to falter, was a testament to the depth of the crisis we faced. But even Elena, this woman of unshakable conviction, in recent months, carried a new, heavier burden, one that cast a noticeable shadow over her usually radiant spirit. Her burden had a name, Matteo. Matteo was her only son, a good boy, as she would always insist to me, her voice laced with a mother's fierce pride and burgeoning concern. And I agreed. He had always been full of life and promise. He had grown up within the very walls of St. Jude's, his childhood interwoven with its sacred rhythms. I could still picture him clearly, a bright-eyed altar boy, his small hand confidently ringing the bells at the consecration, a mischievous grin often playing on his lips even amidst the solemnity. His clear, pure voice had once soared in the choir, a joyful sound lifting our collective hearts to God. But as he entered his late teens, the magnetic pull of the world beyond our church gates had grown too strong, too seductive, too compelling. He had fallen in with a crowd that, while not overtly malicious, was steeped in a pervasive skepticism, a modern cynicism that questioned everything sacred. They were bright, articulate young people, but their intellects were wielded like scalpels, dissecting faith and tradition with casual disdain for institutions, a comfortable dismissal of anything that couldn't be quantified or proven by empirical data. They scoffed at mystery, seeing it as ignorance. And Matteo, once so open to the simple wonders of faith, had begun to echo their rhetoric, a chillingly familiar echo of Arthur Crane's own dismissive language, a refrain that felt like a betrayal from a voice I once knew to sing praises. "Spirituality is a crutch, Father," he'd once said to me, his young eyes hardened by what he believed was newfound wisdom, a shield against vulnerability. "Religion is just a way to control people, to keep them from thinking for themselves, to offer false comfort." He spoke with a confident, practiced detachment. These words, from a boy I had seen take his first communion, were a wound to my heart, a dull ache of disappointment. But to Elena they were a dagger, twisting deep within her maternal spirit, a betrayal of all she had taught him. She would come to me almost invariably, after the last Mass on Sunday, her rosary clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles were bone white, the indentation of the crucifix pressed into her palm. Her voice, usually so steady and resonant in prayer, would be a mere whisper, trembling with an emotion too profound for easy articulation. "Father Michael," she would begin, her gaze fixed not on me, but on some distant, unseen point beyond the confessional screen. "I pray, and I pray for Matteo. Every day, every night, I offer him to Our Lady, to St. Jude. I tell him about the saints, about miracles, about the love of God. But he just shakes his head, Father. He says it's all stories, old superstitions designed for a simpler age. He says the church is failing, losing its grip, just like Mr. Crane says." A heavy, profound sigh would escape her lips then, tasting of dust and despair, a testament to the crushing weight she carried. Then, slowly, painfully, her eyes, usually so bright with an inner light of conviction, would lift to meet mine, brimming with a mother's inconsolable pain, with a raw, agonizing question that pierced me to the very core of my pastoral calling. "Where is God in all this, Father? If he truly cares, if this is truly his house, why does he let this happen? Why does he let us be driven out, scattered like sheep? And why does he let my son lose his way so completely?" Her words were not an accusation, I knew, but a cry from the deepest well of faith, struggling valiantly against an overwhelming, suffocating tide of doubt, a cry for tangible proof that God had not abandoned us to the mercies of men like Arthur Crane. And Elena's question, raw and honest, haunted me in the echoing quiet of my rectory, in brief, fitful moments of sleep, and in the solemnity of Mass. How could I truly answer her, when I myself felt the ground shifting beneath my own feet? I could offer theological explanations of God's mysterious ways, his infinite wisdom, his enduring presence even in suffering, but those were just words, however true. Elena, like so many others in our parish, needed reassurance that resonated not just with the mind, but with the very core of her soul. She needed a tangible sign that God had not abandoned us to the cold mercies of men like Arthur Crane. The struggle of the Diaz family was a microcosm of our parish's plight. Elena's deep-seated faith, the bedrock of our community, was being openly assaulted by the modern world that Matteo embraced, a world demanding empirical evidence for everything, rejecting the unseen and the sacred as mere fantasy. I saw the quiet surrender in the eyes of older parishioners, the resigned slump of their shoulders as they walked past Crane's "for sale" signs. I overheard whispered conversations about what they would do once St. Jude's was gone. It was not merely the loss of a building they mourned, but the scattering of a spiritual family, the dissolution of a sacred anchor in their lives. I offered counsel, pouring myself into every conversation, confession, homily. I reminded them of the perseverance of saints, of the early church's struggles, of Christ's triumph over death. I prayed with them, my hand often clasped tightly around a parishioner's, feeling the tremble in their grip, the desperate yearning for solace. But even as I offered these spiritual balms, I felt a growing sense of helplessness, a profound inadequacy. How could I, a humble priest, fight against the relentless machinery of a modern developer whose sole god was profit, whose only sacred text was a ledger? How could I counteract the insidious poison of cynicism seeping into young hearts, mirroring the world outside? I was a shepherd, yes, but felt like one watching his flock scattered by a wolf he could not fight with worldly means. My sermons, however impassioned, felt like whispers against a hurricane. My prayers, however fervent, sometimes felt swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the heavens. My own faith did not waver. Rather, it was the efficacy of my human efforts, my stewardship, that felt increasingly insufficient. The terrifying, urgent question that gnawed at me, that Elena so eloquently articulated, was how God's power, love, and providence would manifest. This spiritual war was a battle for souls, for the very essence of belief in a world that increasingly scoffed at the unseen, the mysterious, the miraculous. In the face of such overwhelming odds, I found myself, again and again, returning to those silent, desperate prayers in the quiet of the empty church. The need for something beyond human intervention, for a sign that would transcend all doubt, all logic, all cynicism, had become not just hope, but a visceral craving, a cry from the depths of a shepherd's heart, begging for the good shepherd to reveal himself, to gather his lambs, and to prove undeniably that he had not, and would never, abandon his flock. The yearning, that visceral craving for the divine, became a constant companion, a heavy cloak I wore through the late autumn days. Each morning, as the first pale light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Jude's, I would find myself kneeling, the cold marble pressing against my old bones, the silence of the empty church echoing the silence in my soul. I spoke to God with a raw honesty, stripped of liturgical flourish, simply laying bare the desperate plea that had grown within me. Show us, Lord, show us you are here. It was against this backdrop of quiet, fervent supplication that the hammer blow fell. Arthur Crane, a man whose patience was as thin as his wallet was thick, decided the time for negotiations was over. The diocese received his final offer, not long after our conversation with Elena Diaz, as if his impatience had sensed our growing desperation. I remember the call from Bishop Harrison's office, the weariness in his voice. "Father Michael," he began, his tone heavy with a resignation I knew too well, "Mr. Crane has made an ultimatum." His offer was indeed generous, as Crane had so often boasted. Enough, the bishop explained, to build a brand new modern church in a less central, less affluent part of the city. A small, unassuming structure stripped of the grandiosity and history that defined St. Jude's. It was a golden cage for our flock, offering comfort in exchange for our very identity, a modern practicality that severed us from generations of sacred memory etched into our very walls. The catch, of course, was the demand for St. Jude's itself, our prime piece of real estate, our hallowed ground, now seen through the developer's eyes as nothing more than a profitable parcel. And the timeline? A single week. 1 week to accept, or the offer would be rescinded, and a legal battle for eminent domain, which Crane threatened with chilling confidence, would ensue. The bishop, ever a pragmatist, saw little hope in such a fight. The news spread through the parish like a chill wind, rustling the already fragile leaves of hope. It was one thing to fight a slow, grinding battle against decay and debt. It was another to face a clear, precise deadline for our obliteration. The chatter in the vestibule after Mass grew hushed, then turned to worried whispers, then to openly voiced fears. "What will become of us, Father?" Mrs. Rodriguez, her face etched with worry, would ask, her hands twisting her rosary beads. Young families already grappling with the rising cost of living in the neighborhood looked at me with a weary expectation I could barely meet. They wanted answers, solutions, a strategy. All I had were prayers. Arthur Crane, never one to miss an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, chose a town hall meeting, convened by the city to discuss urban renewal plans, to publicly deliver his coup de grace. I had attended, along with a scattering of our parishioners, hoping to articulate the spiritual value of St. Jude's, its role as a bedrock for our community. But Crane cut through my carefully chosen words like a surgical blade. He stood at the podium, bathed in the harsh glow of the municipal fluorescent lights, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn faces of the working-class people gathered. He smiled, a thin, almost predatory expression that never quite reached his eyes. "Let's be realistic, folks," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, amplified by the microphone. He gestured dismissively in my direction. Father Michael here, bless his heart, wants us to believe in miracles. He wants you to pray while the roof is literally caving in, while your children walk past peeling paint and crumbling stone, while the very foundation of this city moves forward, leaving this relic behind. He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. I, on the other hand, deal in reality. I deal in concrete plans, in investment, in progress. I offer solutions, not empty promises from the heavens. Your prayers, he scoffed, have brought you to this very precipice. A week, Father. 1 week to decide if you want to cling to sentiment or embrace a viable future. His words were a poison, precisely as the summary notes, seeping into the parish, creating doubt and division. I saw it in the faces of my flock, the bewildered hurt, the flicker of doubt in eyes that had always held steadfast faith. Some looked down, shamed by his derision. Others, particularly the younger generation like Mateo Diaz, nodded almost imperceptibly, his cynical detachment validated by Crane's brutal pragmatism. He's not wrong, Father, Mateo had said to me later, his voice devoid of anger, merely resigned. We have been praying, and what has it gotten us? A deadline. His words, echoing Elena's earlier anguished question, struck a chord deep within me. My heart ached, not just for St. Jude's, but for the fracturing faith of my people. How could I, a mere priest, argue against such cold, hard reality? What defense did I have against the sheer, unyielding force of Crane's material world? I felt a profound weariness settle over me, heavier than any physical burden. The spiritual war, as I had conceived it, seemed utterly unwinnable by human hands. That night, sleep offered no solace. I walked the empty aisles of St. Jude's, the shadows dancing ominously in the faint light filtering from the street lamps. I stopped at the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows, her eyes downcast, a single tear carved onto her cheek, 7 swords piercing her heart. It was a familiar image, one I had passed countless times, but tonight she seemed to speak to me with a new urgency. Her suffering, her unwavering faith at the foot of the cross, became a beacon in my own spiritual darkness. I remembered the words of St. John Paul II, "Do not be afraid, open wide the doors for Christ." But how, Lord? How do I open the doors when they are being slammed shut by the very forces of the world? Then, a quiet whisper in my soul, a thought that felt both impossibly audacious and profoundly right. We would not fight Crane on his terms. We would not beg for money, nor demand victory over our enemy, for those were worldly desires. Our need was far deeper, far more fundamental. We needed proof, an undeniable assurance, that God had not abandoned us, not a new church building, not a financial reprieve, but a revelation of his presence. It was then, standing before the sorrowful mother, that the idea of the novena crystallized. A novena to Our Lady of Sorrows herself. Not a novena for our intentions, but for God's intention, for his will to be revealed, for his presence to be made manifest. We would ask for a sign, a clear, unmistakable sign that he was with us, here, now, in our despair. The next morning, I announced it after Mass. The atmosphere in the church was palpably tense, heavy with expectation of a strategy, a plea, a plan of action. I stood at the ambo, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "My dear brothers and sisters," I began, my gaze sweeping across their anxious faces. "We stand at a crossroads. The world asks us to abandon what is sacred, to choose material comfort over spiritual heritage. But we, the faithful of St. Jude's, will not abandon our Lord." A murmur rippled through the congregation. They leaned forward, eager. "Arthur Crane has given us an ultimatum," I continued. 1 week to decide. And so we will use that week not to bargain, not to protest, but to pray. We will begin this very evening, a novena, 9 days of ceaseless, fervent prayer to Our Lady of Sorrows. A collective sigh, a mix of confusion and hesitant hope, escaped the congregation. Some exchanged glances, perhaps expecting a more worldly response. "Our intention for this novena," I clarified, my voice rising with conviction, "is not for money. It is not for victory over Arthur Crane. It is not even, ultimately, for the preservation of this building, precious though it is. Our intention is simply this. We will ask for a sign, a clear, undeniable sign that God has not abandoned us, that in our hour of greatest need, he is truly present among us, just as Our Lady stood present at the foot of the cross. We will ask for a manifestation of his divine will, whatever that may be. We will open our hearts to Him completely, without reservation, and beg Him to reveal Himself. The response was not immediate jubilation, but a profound, almost reverent silence. It was as if the audacity of the request, to ask not for a solution, but for a revelation, had taken their breath away. I saw Elena Diaz, her eyes wide with a dawning comprehension, a flicker of something akin to awe. Beside her, Mateo's usual cynical mask had momentarily slipped, replaced by an expression of curious disbelief. And so, the novena began. That first evening, the church was fuller than it had been in months. The air was thick with the scent of old incense, mingled with the faint metallic tang of fear and hope. We prayed the rosary, recited the sorrowful mysteries, and listened to reflections on the Blessed Mother's suffering. Each night, a different parishioner led a decade of the rosary, their voices, some strong and clear, others trembling with emotion, weaving together a tapestry of communal prayer. The days that followed were a testament to the quiet, enduring faith of St. Jude's. People came before work, during their lunch breaks, after school, their faces often streaked with exhaustion, but their eyes alight with a renewed purpose. The flickering votive candles before the statue of Our Lady burned almost continuously, their tiny flames dancing like fragile prayers in the gloom. The confessional line, usually sparse, grew longer as parishioners sought to prepare their souls, to be truly open to whatever God might reveal. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, her hands clasped tightly, tears silently tracing paths down her weathered cheeks as she knelt before the Blessed Sacrament exposed for adoration. I saw young parents, their children often fidgeting beside them, teaching them to whisper the Hail Mary. And I saw Elena Diaz, a steadfast presence in the front pew every evening, her voice a strong, clear thread in the chorus of prayers. Her son, Mateo, still kept his distance, but I noticed him lingering outside the church doors, sometimes even stepping inside to stand in the back, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the altar, a silent observer in a sanctuary of burgeoning faith. His cynicism, though still present, seemed to hold less conviction now, perhaps unsettled by the sheer, unwavering devotion he witnessed. My own days were a blur of prayer, counsel, and quiet contemplation. I felt a paradoxical blend of exhaustion and exhilaration. Each Hail Mary, each Our Father, each moment of silent adoration was a tiny stone laid on a path towards an unknown destination. I preached on the nature of signs in Scripture, on the unwavering faith of Mary, on the mystery of God's ways, but mostly I simply prayed alongside my flock, lending my voice to their collective yearning. The pressure mounted as the days dwindled, the deadline drawing closer. Doubt, like a serpent, would occasionally coil around my heart. What if no sign comes? What then? Will their faith be shattered beyond repair? Will I have led them to a deeper despair? But then I would look at the faces around me, see the quiet determination, the courage to believe in the face of overwhelming odds, and those doubts would recede, replaced by a renewed conviction. We were not demanding God's hand. We were simply opening our own, empty and expectant. We were daring to believe that in His infinite mercy, He would not leave us utterly bereft. By the 9th and final day of the novena, the air in St. Jude's was thick with a palpable tension, a desperate, fragile hope that vibrated in every corner of the old church. The world outside beckoned with its cold, hard reality and its looming deadline. But within these sacred walls, something extraordinary was brewing, a collective spiritual energy, a prayer so pure, so insistent, that it felt as if it could pierce the very heavens. We had done all we could do as humans. We had prayed, and now we simply waited. The 9th day dawned, not with a flourish of trumpets or a celestial choir, but with the soft, persistent tap of rain against the sacristy window, a sound both mournful and cleansing. I had spent the night restless, my sleep fragmented by a kaleidoscope of anxieties and prayers, each thought a silent negotiation with the heavens. The waiting, as the previous day had ended, was the hardest part. It was a vacuum filled only by our collective yearning, a space where all human endeavor had ceased, giving way to an almost unbearable stillness. Now, that stillness was being challenged by the inexorable march of time. I rose before the first light truly pierced the gloom, feeling the weary stiffness in my bones, a physical manifestation of the spiritual battle waged over the past 9 days. The familiar scent of old wood and beeswax in my small rectory room usually brought a sense of peace, but this morning it was mingled with something sharper, like anticipation mixed with dread. I dressed slowly, my cassock feeling heavier than usual. Each buttoning of the fabric a small, deliberate act of surrender to the day's unknown decree. As I walked the short path from the rectory to the church, the air was cool and damp against my face, carrying the earthy smell of wet soil. The streetlights still cast a dim, yellow glow, blurring the edges of the old houses that lined the street. St. Jude's stood sentinel, its stone facade appearing even more ancient and vulnerable under the gray sky. This morning, it wasn't just a building. It was the crucible of our faith, the stage for whatever drama God had chosen to unfold. Entering the sacristy, the familiar quiet was amplified. Father Michael, my ever-dependable assistant, was already there, meticulously preparing the chalice and paten. His movements were precise, reverent, but I could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. He looked up as I entered, offering a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Father Thomas," he murmured, his voice hushed. "Good morning, Michael," I replied, the words feeling thin and fragile in the heavy silence. "A momentous day." He nodded, not needing further elaboration. "The faithful are gathering already, even at this hour." He gestured towards the main doors, and I could hear it then, a faint, distant murmur, like the hum of a disturbed beehive, already filtering through the thick oaken stone. It was a sound I knew well, but today it was different, less a comfort, more a portent. It was the sound of over 500 souls, each bearing their own unique burden of hope and fear, all converging on this single sacred space. I went to the vestment cabinet, my fingers brushing over the familiar silks and brocades. The white chasuble, pristine and simple, felt heavy with the weight of its symbolism. As I donned it, Father Michael helped with the stole and maniple, our movements almost a practiced dance, but infused with an unspoken gravity. Each prayer I whispered as I vested felt less like a formula and more like a desperate plea, a raw, unedited conversation with the Almighty. I was not just dressing for Mass. I was armoring myself for a spiritual confrontation, preparing to stand as a vessel, however unworthy, between my flock and the vast, unfathomable will of God. As I finished vesting, a sense of profound stillness settled upon me, an inner quiet that transcended the tremor in my hands. It was the stillness of surrender, the quiet acceptance that all I could do was offer myself, broken and uncertain, to the divine purpose. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the scent of old incense and fresh linens fill my lungs. "Thy will be done," I whispered, the ancient words a balm and a challenge. Then, it was time. Father Michael opened the sacristy door, and the full rush of the congregation's presence washed over me. The church was indeed packed beyond capacity. Every pew was filled, bodies pressed close, shoulders brushing. People stood along the walls, in the aisles, even spilling out into the narthex. The air was thick with the mingled scents of human bodies, damp coats, and a potent cocktail of expectation and anxiety. It was a sight I had not seen at St. Jude's in decades, a bittersweet vindication that even in their doubt, or perhaps because of it, they had come. They had gathered, not out of routine, but out of a desperate, primal need to witness. My gaze swept across the sea of faces. The elderly women with their rosaries clutched tight, the young families holding their children close, the teenagers with their restless energy subdued by the solemnity of the moment. I saw Elena Diaz, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes burning with an unshakable faith, kneeling in the third pew, her rosary beads flying through her fingers. Next to her, Mateo, her son, stood awkwardly, his usual slouch replaced by a rigid posture, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the altar, a strange mixture of cynicism and yearning playing on his features. He was one of the many I knew, who had come perhaps not to pray, but to observe, to see if faith truly held any sway in a world that demanded tangible proof. And then my eyes landed, inevitably, on the first pew. There he sat, like a stone gargoyle come to life, Arthur Crane. He was unmistakable, a dark, tailored suit, a stark contrast to the faded, humble fabric of the pews. His posture was ramrod straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the packed church with an almost predatory satisfaction. There was no humility in his gaze, no reverence, only a cold, calculating triumph. He had come, as he had promised, to witness the final, unanswered prayer, to watch us, his vanquished opponents, perform our last rites before he signed the papers that would tear down our sanctuary and erase our history. His presence felt like a desecration, a sneering challenge to the very essence of what we were trying to do. It was as if he brought the cold, hard reality of the world directly into the sacred space, daring God to prove his existence. A fresh wave of anger, fleeting but potent, surged through me. How could a man be so utterly devoid of spiritual imagination, so deaf to the whispers of eternity? But then the anger receded, replaced by a deeper, more profound sadness. He wasn't just an opponent, he was a lost soul, a man trapped in a fortress of his own making, a fortress built of steel and money, impervious to grace. He sat there, oblivious to the anguish and desperate hope that vibrated around him, a stark, living monument to the very crisis of faith that had brought us all to this precipice. I took my place at the head of the procession, Father Michael and the altar servers behind me. The organ began its mournful, hopeful prelude, a single, sustained chord that seemed to hang in the heavy air, vibrating with the collective emotion of the congregation. As I walked down the aisle, my eyes met some of the parishioners, and in their gazes I saw everything: fear, trust, resignation, a defiant flicker of hope. I offered them a small, reassuring nod, a silent acknowledgement of our shared journey. This was not just my burden, but ours, a communal offering to a God who, we prayed, had not abandoned us. Reaching the altar, I genuflected, a gesture of profound humility that today felt more like a desperate prostration. The opening prayers felt strange and distant on my tongue. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The response, "And with your spirit," was a wave of sound, strong but tinged with an unspoken question. I tried to anchor myself in the liturgy's familiar rhythm, but my mind raced, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This felt less like a routine mass and more like a final stand, a battle being waged not with swords and shields, but with prayers and intentions in the invisible spiritual realm. The readings were chosen with deliberate care for this day of ultimate petition. The first, from the prophet Jeremiah, spoke of hope in desolation. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." The words, usually comforting, today felt like a double-edged sword, a promise that could either uplift or mock. The responsorial psalm was, "The Lord is my shepherd," sung with a fragile sincerity that brought tears to many eyes. The Gospel, from Luke, recounted the parable of the persistent widow, who tirelessly petitioned an unjust judge until she received justice. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I looked up from the lectionary, my gaze falling again on Arthur Crane in the front pew. He sat impassive, as if the words of Scripture were merely an ancient, irrelevant hum. The parable felt like a direct challenge, not only to God, but to Crane himself. We were the persistent widow. He was the unjust judge, but our petition was to a different judge entirely. My homily was brief, perhaps the shortest I had ever delivered. I spoke not of victory, nor even of a specific outcome, but of faith itself. "My dear brothers and sisters," I began, my voice soft but resonant in the hushed church, "for 9 days we have prayed. We have poured out our hearts to Our Lady of Sorrows, asking for a sign, not for money, not for a building, not for earthly triumph. We have asked simply for a sign that God has not abandoned us, that He is with us." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the congregation, meeting eyes filled with a myriad of emotions. We stand today at the precipice. We have done all we can do. We have offered our prayers, our hopes, our fears, and now we surrender. We place our trust entirely in Him, not in our understanding, not in our plans, but in His infinite wisdom and mercy. Whatever the outcome, whatever tomorrow may bring, let us remember this: our faith is not in what we see, but in what we believe. Our God is not limited by our expectations, nor by the realities of this world. He is God. My voice trembled slightly on those last words. Let us then offer this Mass, not as a demand, but as an act of profound, humble adoration. Let us receive Him in the Eucharist, with open hearts, ready to accept His will, knowing that even in silence, He speaks. Even in darkness, His light endures. The liturgy of the Eucharist began. The offering of gifts felt particularly poignant. Parishioners, many of whom had been giving sacrificially for years, brought forth the bread and wine, simple elements that would soon be transformed. As I prepared the altar, my hands, usually steady with years of practice, trembled faintly. The weight of the chalice, the smooth surface of the paten, felt charged with an almost unbearable significance. Every gesture, every whispered prayer, was infused with the collective yearning of the hundreds of souls gathered around me. "Lift up your hearts," I intoned, the ancient command echoing in the silence. The response, "We lift them up to the Lord," was a murmur of assent, a fragile ascent from the valley of doubt to the mountain of hope. The Sanctus rose, a swell of voices, perhaps not perfectly in tune, but united in a fervent cry to heaven. "Holy, holy, holy Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of your glory. Hosanna in the highest." As I approached the consecration, a profound silence descended upon the church, deeper than any I had ever experienced. The very air seemed to thicken, holding its breath. The world outside, with its looming deadlines and cold, hard realities, receded into nothingness. There was only the altar, the simple bread and wine, and the 500 waiting souls, their hopes and fears converging into a single, palpable energy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the quiet. This was the moment, the most sacred part of our liturgy, performed countless times in countless churches, but today it felt utterly unique, freighted with an almost unbearable tension. Every fiber of my being was focused on the simple, white host resting on the paten. Could God truly manifest himself here now, in such a direct, undeniable way, as we had so boldly, so desperately asked? Doubts, insidious and swift, flickered at the edges of my consciousness. The long history of unanswered prayers, the quiet suffering of so many good people, the undeniable power of the world, personified by the man in the front pew. But I pushed them back, drawing on every ounce of faith that remained within me. I was a priest. This was my sacred duty, to believe, to proclaim, to make present, regardless of the outcome. I was a vessel, nothing more, entirely dependent on God's grace. It was not my power, but His. I took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of old wood and wax grounding me. I looked at the simple, unleavened bread, soon to become the body of Christ, and then I raised it, my hands, for all their trembling, holding it aloft, a pure white disk against the dim backdrop of the sanctuary. My voice, though strained, rang out through the profound silence, clear and unwavering. Hoc est enim corpus meum, for this is my body. Hoc est enim corpus meum, for this is my body. My voice, thin with the weight of that final, desperate prayer, had barely faded into the hushed air of St. Jude's when the world shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, nor a clap of thunder, but something far more profound, more unsettling, more utterly divine. I stood there, my arms aching slightly from the prolonged elevation of the host, my gaze fixed on the simple disk of unleavened bread, awaiting the familiar, unseen transformation. The silence in the church was absolute, a heavy blanket woven from 500 anxieties, 500 prayers, 500 flickers of hope and despair. And then it began. Not with a flash or a dramatic flourish, but with an agonizingly slow, almost imperceptible unveiling. At the very center of the pure white host, a pinprick of crimson appeared. So small, so utterly perfect, it might have been an illusion, a trick of the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows, or a figment of my overwrought imagination. My heart, which had been pounding a moment before with the priest's customary reverence, now faltered, skipping a beat, then thrumming with a new, terrifying rhythm. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, then opened them again, desperate for it to be gone, for sanity to return. But it was still there, and it was growing. The single perfect drop of red, glistening like a jewel, seemed to swell, its edges spreading, radiating outwards with an unsettling organic pulse. It wasn't a stain that seeped in from the outside. It originated from within, as if the very substance of the host were giving birth to this impossible color. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, choked sound. My hands, which had trembled with human frailty moments before, now solidified, gripping the Eucharist with an almost unnatural strength, fearing to drop it, fearing to move at all. Then another drop emerged, distinct yet joining the first, merging seamlessly, and another, like tears slowly welling up from an unseen source. They were not opaque or dull. They possessed a luminous quality, a depth of color that spoke of life, vibrant and fresh. It was a hue I knew intimately from the crucifixes, from the Stations of the Cross, from countless meditations on the Passion, yet had never seen outside of painted wood or canvas. This was different. This was living. The crimson drops coalesced, not running immediately, but forming a viscous, glistening pool in the very heart of the host. The white perimeter of the bread served as a stark, sacred frame for this impossible portrait. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the liquid deepened in color, becoming a rich, vital carmine. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, defying the usual properties of fluid on a porous surface. It didn't soak in, it simply gathered, intensified, and then, slowly, inexorably, began its descent. A slender rivulet, like a miniature river of life, began to flow. It traced a delicate path down the side of the consecrated host, so careful, so gentle, as if the sacred blood itself were choosing its trajectory. It gleamed, catching the faint light from the sanctuary lamp, reflecting it back as a dark, wet sheen. My thumb, still holding the bottom edge of the host, suddenly felt a distinct, undeniable warmth. The trickle reached it, a warm, slick sensation against my skin. It wasn't sticky or metallic, but smooth, almost silken, undeniably wet. In that moment, a sound rippled through the congregation. It wasn't a shout or a scream, but a single unified gasp, a collective intake of breath, sharp and sudden, that sounded like the tearing of a veil. It was the sound of over 500 souls, simultaneously stripped of their illusions, their doubts, their preconceived notions of reality. The gasp hung in the air, a suspended moment of pure, raw astonishment, before it dissolved into an even deeper, more profound silence. A silence so absolute, so heavy, it felt as though the very air in the church had been sucked out, replaced by an ethereal vacuum. I stood there, still holding the host aloft, my arm now rigid, unmoving. My eyes were fixed on the bleeding Eucharist, my own heart hammering against my ribs, a drumbeat of terror and awe. The terror was primal, the fear of standing before the unveiled mystery, of touching the untouchable. But the awe transcended all earthly emotion. It was a profound, soul-shattering recognition of the divine, a realization that everything I had ever believed, everything I had ever preached, was not merely true, but physically, tangibly, miraculously present before me. This wasn't a symbol. This was Him. My gaze swept involuntarily across the congregation, a blur of faces, all frozen in various states of disbelief, but my eyes snagged on one particular figure, one face that stood out in stark relief: Arthur Crane. He was in the very front pew, exactly where he had positioned himself, a cynical spectator to what he had presumed would be our final, ignominious defeat. His face had gone white, not merely pale, but a stark, bloodless white, like alabaster. The familiar, sneering smirk that had so often twisted his lips, the one that conveyed his disdain for faith and his absolute certainty in his own power, had vanished completely. It was as if it had been wiped away by an invisible hand, leaving behind an empty canvas of utter shock. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide, dilated, fixed unblinking on the host I held. They reflected a pure, unadulterated terror, a primal fear that had nothing to do with market values or property lines, and everything to do with the unraveling of his entire worldview. His jaw hung slightly open, as if he had been about to utter some cutting remark, only to have the words die on his tongue, suffocated by the impossible vision before him. The muscles in his neck were rigid, strained, and his hands, which had been loosely clasped over his knee, were now clenched into tight, bloodless fists. He was utterly, completely paralyzed by what he was witnessing. The sophisticated, ruthless developer, the man who believed only in the material, the tangible, the provable, was confronted with something that shattered every single one of his carefully constructed realities. The bleeding was slow, deliberate, as if God himself were drawing out the moment, allowing every single soul in that sanctuary to bear witness, to absorb the full impact of this impossible truth. The host, once a simple white disk, was now a vibrant tableau of sacrifice and love, a miniature Calvary held in my trembling hands. The blood continued to ooze, not profusely, but steadily, a clear, unmistakable stream of living crimson. It seemed to pulse, to possess a warmth that radiated outwards, filling the sacred space not with heat, but with an intense, palpable presence. I could feel a deep, resonant hum beginning to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath my feet, through the air itself. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a spiritual frequency that resonated with the core of my being. My mind, usually so active, so burdened with the countless concerns of the parish, was utterly silent. There was only the host, the blood, and the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful reality of God made manifest. It was not a trick of the light. It was not a hallucination. It was real, as undeniably real as the ancient stones of St. Jude's, as the faded frescoes above, as the terrified, awestruck faces of the congregation. And it was all for them, for Elena Diaz, whose daily rosaries had been answered in a way she could never have imagined, for Mateo, whose cynicism was now dissolving before his very eyes, and yes, for Arthur Crane, the man who had come to gloat, but who now stared at the undeniable proof of the real presence bleeding before his very eyes, his face a testament to a soul in the throes of an unimaginable upheaval. The silence stretched, thick and profound, broken only by the soft, almost inaudible sound of the blood continuing its slow, sacred journey down the side of the host. The world had stopped, and God had spoken, not with thunder, but with a single crimson tear. Time, that relentless river, simply ceased. It pooled and shimmered in the sacred stillness, thick and profound, broken only by the soft, almost inaudible sound of the blood continuing its slow, sacred journey down the side of the host. The world had stopped, and God had spoken, not with thunder, but with a single crimson tear. My hands, still aloft, felt not the slight weight of a consecrated wafer, but the immense, throbbing pulse of the universe. The crimson drop that had first appeared, no larger than a pinprick, had now blossomed, a delicate, living bloom of blood that traced a path down the pure white disk, onto my thumb, and then, inexorably, towards the ancient silver paten I held beneath. It was not merely a stain or a trick of the light. It possessed a depth of color, a vital luminescence that defied all natural explanation. It breathed, it lived. A single, unified gasp had swept through the congregation when the first drop appeared, a sound like wind sighing through a vast communal soul. Now, that gasp had settled into an even deeper silence, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all other sound, save for the quiet, ragged breath of 500 souls in suspended animation. Then it began, not with shouts or exclamations, but with a gentle rustling, as if a collective breeze swept through the pews. One by one, then in waves, people began to sink. Knees hit worn wood with soft thuds, foreheads bowed, shoulders trembled. A soft weeping began, a sound like rain on parched earth, hesitant at first, then growing into a tender chorus of release and adoration. There was no panic, no questioning, no clamor for scientific verification in that moment, only a deep, penetrating reverence, a primal recognition of the holy. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a palpable holiness, a sensation that prickled the skin and brought a warmth to the chest, like sunlight after a long, cold night. My own heart, which had been a frantic drum against my ribs, now settled into a steady, awed rhythm. Terror had mingled with an unutterable joy, a profound sense of my own unworthiness standing before such a manifest wonder, yet also a sense of being utterly, intimately chosen. For 35 years I had stood at this altar, at countless altars, repeating the ancient words of consecration, Hoc est enim corpus meum, for this is my body. I had believed these words with every fiber of my being, preached the real presence, taught the mystery of transubstantiation. But belief, however fervent, is a different country than experience. Now, the veil had been ripped, and I held not merely a symbol, but the very flesh and blood of my Savior tangibly, undeniably, weepingly present. It was as if every theological text I had ever studied, every homily I had ever given, every prayer I had ever whispered, had converged in this single, luminous instant, burning away all doubt, all intellectual abstraction, leaving only raw, burning truth. I continued to hold the bleeding host aloft for what felt like an eternity, allowing the sacred silence to deepen, allowing the truth to sink into every heart. Then, with a trembling reverence, I slowly lowered it, My gaze swept over the congregation, seeing not just faces, but souls laid bare. I knew with an intuitive certainty that I could not simply consume this host. This miracle was not for my private contemplation. It was a gift, a sign, a testament. Carefully, with hands that shook slightly despite my resolve, I reached for the golden monstrance that stood ready on the altar, its polished rays usually empty until adoration. My fingers, still bearing the faint sacred trace of crimson, fumbled with the clasp that held the lunette. I gently, ever so gently, placed the bleeding host within its transparent vessel, securing it so that the miracle remained visible for all to see. The gold of the monstrance seemed to glow with a new intensity, reflecting the light from the stained glass windows, now filtering into the church as if in deference to the divine presence. As I secured the lunette, my eyes found Elena Diaz. She was on her knees, her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. But these were not the bitter tears of anguish I had grown accustomed to seeing in her eyes. This was pure, unadulterated joy, a mother's relief, a believer's affirmation. Her decades of unwavering faith, her countless rosaries whispered for her wayward son, for the salvation of our parish, had been answered in a way that shattered all expectations. Her faith, which had been a quiet ember, now blazed like a forest fire. Beside her, Matteo stood, utterly frozen, a statue carved from shock and wonder. His cynical sneer, that hardened mask of modern disillusionment, had utterly vanished, stripped away by the raw power of the divine. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the bleeding host in the monstrance. A track of tears, clear and clean, ran down his face, carving paths through the dust of his former skepticism. I watched as his shoulders slumped, as if a great invisible burden had been lifted, or simply shattered. And then, slowly, haltingly, his knees buckled. He too fell to the floor, not in a practiced genuflection, but in a collapsing heap of utter surrender. His head bowed, his tears now flowing freely, openly, unashamedly. The prodigal son had returned, not to a father's house, but to the very presence of God made manifest. But my gaze inevitably was drawn to the man in the front pew, Arthur Crane. His cynical smirk, that familiar shield of arrogance, was not merely gone, it had been incinerated. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, a ghastly white against the dark wood of the pew. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide with a terror that clawed at his very soul. He had come to gloat, to witness the final, pathetic gasp of a dying faith. Instead, he had witnessed the heart of that faith bleeding, vibrant and alive, defying all his carefully constructed realities. He had been staring, transfixed, when I placed the host in the monstrance. His gaze never left it. Even as the rest of the congregation stirred with their reverent weeping, I saw his jaw clench, then loosen. I saw a tremor begin in his hands, then spread through his arms, his shoulders. He swayed slightly, as if struck by an invisible force. The very air around him seemed to crackle with the intensity of his internal struggle, a mighty war being waged within the fortress of his hardened heart. And then, with a sound like a gasp torn from the depths of his being, Arthur Crane, the man of steel and stone, the man who believed in nothing he could not build or buy, crumpled. His body seemed to give way entirely, his knees hitting the kneeler with a jarring thud that echoed in the profound silence. His head fell forward, his broad shoulders shaking violently. His carefully maintained composure, his ruthless self-assurance, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Deep, guttural sobs, raw and uncontrolled, began to tear from him, echoing through the sacred space. They were not the soft, reverent tears of the faithful, but the wrenching cries of a soul utterly broken, utterly undone, utterly remade in a single, holy instant. He was no longer Arthur Crane, the formidable developer. He was simply a man, stripped bare, laid low, encountering God in a way that defied every tenet of his materialistic world. The miracle was not just a sign, it was a hammer, shattering the edifice of his disbelief, creating fissures through which the light of divine truth could finally pour. He wept not for loss, but for the profound, overwhelming revelation of a truth he had scorned his entire life. He wept for himself, for his blindness, and perhaps for the first time, for the sheer, astonishing grace that had pursued him, cornered him, and now finally embraced him. I stood there, a simple priest, witnessing not just a physical miracle, but the miracle of a soul's conversion, a community's rebirth. This bleeding host, now encased in gold, was not merely a wonder to behold. It was a tangible, pulsating testament that God had not abandoned us, that He truly was present in the Eucharist, truly with us, not just in spirit, but in body, blood, soul, and divinity. The war for St. Jude's was over. A new chapter had begun, written not in earthly contracts, but in living divine blood. A new chapter indeed. The ink of that divine narrative, crimson and vibrant, is still drying on the pages of St. Jude's history, even weeks after that fateful Mass. The air within our old church, once heavy with the scent of dust and fading hopes, now hums with a palpable sense of grace. The very stones seem to breathe with renewed life. St. Jude's was never sold. How could it be? The world had seen what had transpired within these walls. The story, whispered first in awe-filled tones, then proclaimed with evangelical fervor, spread like holy fire. Our humble parish, once threatened with demolition, is now a diocesan shrine. Pilgrims come from all corners, their faces etched with a profound reverence, drawn by the undeniable presence of the miraculous. They kneel before the golden monstrance, where the sacred host, still weeping its silent crimson testament, rests. The blood, preserved by the divine hand that willed its manifestation, remains vibrant, a perpetual chalice offering solace and conviction. Each morning as I approach the altar, I see the light catch its rich hue, a daily reminder of God's boundless love made visible. Arthur Crane, the man of cold steel and colder currency, withdrew his offer to the diocese the very next morning. His subsequent actions have been nothing short of astonishing. He didn't just walk away. He turned his considerable resources, his entire fortune, towards the complete restoration of our beloved church. The cracking plaster has been meticulously repaired, the fading frescoes lovingly brought back to their original splendor, each stroke a brush dipped in repentance and newfound faith. I often see him, not in his pristine suits, but in work clothes, overseeing the artisans, his gaze no longer calculating, but contemplative. "Father," he said to me just yesterday, his voice softer, less guarded than I had ever known it, "I'm ready." He wasn't speaking of a building project, but of his soul. I am now preparing him for his baptism, guiding him through the catechism, witnessing the quiet unfolding of a heart once hardened, now tender and receptive. He still fumbles with the prayers, but his devotion is pure, his longing for God undeniable. And the Diaz family? Their laughter, once a rare and fragile sound, now rings freely through the church hall. Elena weeps still, but these are tears of joy and gratitude. Mateo, her son, no longer stands cynically in the shadows. He is now one of our most devoted ushers, his youthful face bright with a faith that has been not merely rekindled, but forged anew in divine fire. He helps direct the pilgrims, his own testimony a quiet sermon to those who seek. This miracle, you see, did so much more than save a building. It healed a community, knitting together torn threads of faith and doubt. It converted a soul, proving that no heart is too hardened for God's transformative grace. I understand now, more deeply than words can convey, that God does not work miracles merely to confound the skeptics, though that too can be a blessed outcome. No, He works them, primarily, to console the faithful, to remind us, in our darkest hours of doubt and despair, that He is truly with us, body, blood, soul, and divinity. He never abandoned St. Jude's, and He will never abandon us. His presence is a promise, written in the very blood of His Son, a promise we now hold, tangible and breathtaking, in our consecrated hands.